You'll never go away, while the rainbow in my sky, my colors in the gray, my only wish is the sunshine of the day, the only song that my piano ever plays. And even if you say goodbye, you'll always be around to lift me up and take me high, keep my feet close to the ground. Are you proud of me tonight? Dreams are coming true. I choose the light, nothing to lose if I lose you. New day won't everyone cries, don't cry. Darkness will fade, all the pain will go by, but we will stay, even if you say goodbye. Si tu dis adieu, tu ne partiras jamais. Aucun ciel, un ciel bleu. Mais que le temps me crie, on se souhaite sans anxiété. Un rayon de ma journée, la seule chanson que mon piano peut jouer. Darkness will fade, and the pain will go by, but even as you say.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Muslim Women Speakers Friday Forum. My name is Soraya Dean. We have a prolific meeting of minds today. Our topic is the making, the reverse abrogation. Is there a theological solution to Hamas-Israel conflict? We say this because we are exploring many solutions. And today we are seeing whether, let's go to the theology. Is there something wrong there? And this particular topic is very close to me because after October 7th, in the December of 2023, I took my rabbi friend Karen Bender to the local mosque where we have gone many times. And as that day, as we sat and listened to the Jummah, the sermon, I was very embarrassed because the Imam went on about how bad the Jews are, that how the Jews cannot be trusted, and this is Los Angeles, so these things have concerned us deeply, and we know that anti-Semitism is seeping across the world, not only in the Muslim world. So the questions we want to ask is, did Muslim dislike for the Jews begin in Islam's formative years? Because for me, as a Muslim, and Anila here she's a Muslim who has valiantly, who has courageously led this charge of addressing anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. It taunts us. It maligns the beauty of my faith and my community. What are we? Are we become anti-Semites? Are we called by divine edict to be Jew haters? So we have to speak about it. This is not the time for us to be condemning, calling out. We have to do something more than that. This is about correcting. This is about collaborating, and this is about communicating openly. Because we have come far, I believe, from blaming Islam, denouncing sermons, seeking apologies, filing police complaints, and launching petitions against the imams, calling for dismissal and deportation. It's not going to help anyone. This is about supporting moderate Muslim voices to spread the message of tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Because we know some religious actors fool this, and while some are very silent about this. So in our room today is I would call him a very dear friend. We've been speaking so often, and I'm just blown away by his knowledge. I can listen to Israel for hours. He founded the Nieman Academy. He's an author of several books, a prolific scholar. his latest book, Hamas, Jihad and Anti-Semitism in the Islamic World, Conquest and Manipulation of the Palestinian Nationalism. A fascinating read. We should all buy that book and read. I'm going to post it in the chat shortly. And maybe, Elana, I sent you a copy of that book. So the Naaman Academy, which you founded, Israel, equips one with the tools to confront anti-Semitism, misinformation, and understand global challenges like jihad and global extremism. Our Sheikh today, who cannot be here today, welcome, Israel. Our Sheikh Musa, he just sent me a message. He's in an emergency. He just returned from Israel. Another Muslim who talks honestly about the need for love and compassion between Muslims and Jews. He has just returned from Israel, and we wanted to hear more from him. He led an interfaith delegation to promote face-to-face solidarity after October 7th. And also in the room is Anila, the founder of American Muslim Multi-Faith Women's Empowerment Council. If there's any woman who has done so much to fight anti-Semitism, that would be my friend and colleague, Anila. She has mobilized groups. I'm sure she didn't sleep more than 3 hours last night, planning and doing this kind of work. So let's begin with you, Israel. The floor is yours because the Sheikh is unable to come. We talked about some topics. So we are talking specifically in this conversation today about abrogation, why it was used, and today's need to reverse it. And what are we trying to reverse? What is this Meccan period? Can you briefly explain all this to us?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to be here. And yes, I published a book, Hamas Jihad. I've written a lot of other blogs, whatever else. So let's start here. And when I wrote the book, I actually wrote 2 chapters at the same time, chapter 1 and chapter 9. The first one dealing with negative image of Jews in the Quran, Muslim sources, but also chapter 9, which was about reverse abrogation. And he did them at the same time as I was investigating the Quran and reading it over several times. Okay, so first of all, if we speak about going back to the Meccan period, in the very formative years of Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad begins having revelations and begins reciting what he hears, what he receives, and it starts being written down, around the year 610. Now, the Meccan period goes from 610 to 622, 12, 13 years. And that is when he is with, amongst his own people, the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, and he is advocating monotheism. And he is accepting of Jews, of Christians, and of overall debate. Discussion. In other words, what he's speaking about is persuading people to understand his perspective. And he comes out of a Judeo-Christian understanding because he is certainly somewhat familiar with both of the religions. Remember, Mecca, as well as Medina and all the way down to Yemen, were on the trade route, and Jews and Christians, as well as pagan tribes and Zoroastrians from Persia were on that route, and there was a lot of discussion about religion. So it was quite open. Now, in this period, he develops a following known as the Creed. Those are the first followers. And often these first followers were taunted and abused by the Quraysh tribe, of which Muhammad was a member. They were not very tolerant. There were a few who were converted into Islam or were more tolerant, but it wasn't an easy period yet. This was not a time where he moved towards any sort of physical clash. In the end, by the year 622, Muhammad and his followers, due to violence, were forced to go to Medina, where there happened to be 3 Jewish tribes and a few pagan tribes who eventually would convert to Islam. The Jewish tribes did not. Get into that in a second. But the point here is when we read the Quran and the surahs or chapters that are from the Meccan period, it is open, it is understanding, and in particular towards the Jews. And here is where I say the Quran definitely has a pro-Zionist approach in the Meccan period. There is no doubt, and there are numerous quotes. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to quote them all. Soraya, I sent you a whole list of them and said it's a partial list. You'd be surprised, there are probably several dozen. And they deal with the covenant. They deal with the rights of the Israelites, Jews, to the promised land. And much of the Quran, a good quarter, up to 30% or so, actually goes through the Exodus from Egypt, as well as other stories from the Hebrew scriptures, or Old Testament, and some stories also about Jesus and the New Testament. In other words, quite open, and obviously doesn't agree on everything because it's a different religion. But the idea was to be open and embracing of these other understandings. Also, Muhammad at the beginning believed he was a continuation of Jewish prophecy. In the end, he says, he gets the understanding. He is the prophet to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Arabs. In other words, he is the Arabian Moses, right? Whereas Moses would be, the Jewish leader, which led the Israelites out of Egypt and across Sinai, but never actually came into the land of Israel. It's a whole other story. So that's one. The Meccan period, open, pluralistic understanding, even if suffering some abuse, the creed. Then we have that attitude to the Jews is favorable, and they speak of the covenant, the holy agreement between the Israelites and God. And what is that agreement? That agreement is you, meaning the Israelites, keep my laws, right? Is God saying my laws? And you will have the promised land. If not, you'll be exiled. And we know there were 2 exiles from the promised land. One point, Israelites banished, but then came back under the Persians, banished during the Babylonian period, but then came back some 50 years later. And we had with the Roman period, close to 2,000 years ago. And today you have the state of Israel. What is interesting about all this is that it's actually predicted not only at the end of Torah, right, the 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament, but it's also in the Quran, okay? And it says if the Jews, they've been punished, they're in exile, right? All this takes place in the 600s when the Quran is being 600s, 700s when it's being put together. It says if they're good, they'll also be rewarded if they behave. And here we have it today. And that's what gets me. Why don't people take a look here and say, okay, this is biblical and Quranic prophecy? Instead, there's an emphasis on the Medina period when there was the breakout from the Arabian Peninsula and the capture of many areas, all the way through North Africa, up to Spain, Portugal, Balkans, and out to India and sub-Saharan areas of Africa, okay, which is later on, it's a jihad period. But let me just digress a bit, and a few words from the Quran, or paraphrasing. You have in Surah, or chapter 10, verses 89 through 93, where Pharaoh is destroyed. This is discussed in the Quran. And the Israelites are settled in a blessed land, which is the promised land, the land of Israel. You have Moses being given the scriptures, and I quote, a testimony, a guide, and a blessing. And it says right there, and it's being directed at Muhammad because he's the one reciting it, that Allah says, and you were not there on the mount when I gave this blessing, this revelation. Okay? In other words, the Israelites, the Jews, they were there first. Doesn't mean you don't have a place. Obviously do, otherwise I wouldn't have all these revelations. And it's a guide, all right? And the book is Torah, right? And it's also clear in the Quran that Torah has a very important place and that the Jews are supposed to follow Torah, and if they do, they'll be rewarded. But moving right along, it constantly speaks of the covenant, at times saying follow it and everything will be fine. Other times there are admonitions. You broke the covenant, you will be punished in exile. We Jews say the same thing. Why are we in exile so often? Because we did the wrong thing. So when the Quran repeats what we said in saying you're being punished, it's true. I don't think anybody would argue with that. But the point is, Jewish people came back to the land of Israel. That's not recognized. And that's what's problematic, because that too is in the Quran. So like I said, theologically, there's no reason for this conflict, any of this conflict. Partition plan of 1947 should have been accepted Arabs living in the Jewish area, Jews living in the Arab area. It's all the land of Israel, and everybody could live there. What's the problem? Okay, but moving right along, going back to the Quran, you have in Surah, or chapter 7, verse 137, where it says that Allah fulfills his promise and the Israelites, Jews, are given the eastern and western lands, meaning east and west of the Jordan River, in the land of Israel. That's what the Muslim scholars have said over the years before there was a state of Israel. Okay, east and west, because we know that the tribes led by Moses and then Joshua, 2.5 settled on the eastern side, and all the others on the western side out of the 12 tribes plus the tribe of Levi or Levi. Okay, and Surah 9, verse 111 says that Allah's promise is in Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran. In other words, puts all three of them out there, saying, follow. This is what needs to be done. And it means all three of the Abrahamic religions can get along. Surah, or chapter 17, verse 103, 104. And this I will quote. And we said to the children of Israel, now, dwell in the land, but when the promised time of the hereafter comes, we shall bring you all together, and the Israelites be settled in the promised land. Okay, so we're going to bring you all together. Now, dwell in the land, but when the promised time of the hereafter comes, we shall bring you all together. That is paraphrasing from Deuteronomy, the 5th of the 5 books of Moses, or Torah, which makes it very, very clear that the redemption will also gather all the souls who have passed on to the next world. And they'll come back to the land and live there in the end time when the Messiah arrives. The Quran says the exact same thing, but in much shorter version. Because in Torah, it's pretty long. It talks about blessings and curses or whatever else. But here they're very succinct. And then last and not least, we have the abrogation verse. Surah 2, or chapter 2, 106. If we abrogate any verse or cause it to be forgotten, we will replace it by a better one or one similar. Do you not know that Allah has power over all things? Now, what happened? There are contradictions in holy books. I know virtually all religions that I've studied have such things. And in Islam, it sorts it out. It says, look, our scholars essentially are saying, we'll decide. The problem was the original abrogations done in the Middle Ages was eliminating the positive surahs, verses about Jews, Christians, and others. Why? Because there was this successful conquest and jihad, and very often done very brutally, led often by the hadiths, and there's a whole argument as to how much it can be trusted. Yes, no, I'm not going into it. That's not my place, but I've listened to different Islamic scholars discussing it. And my take was, wait a minute, if you're using abrogation and it was used for this jihad, or call it holy war in the name of Islam and Sharia law, and it got to a certain point by the 600s, 1600s, 1700s, and it's no longer winning, and Islam was withdrawing, there was a counteroffensive, if you want, the rollback by Christendom, both in Europe and in India. The British arrived in India. In Europe, it was the Balkan countries, that area, and Austria-Hungary, and whatever. And wait a minute. Maybe there's a sign that it's time to use that same tool of abrogation to say, wait a minute, pluralism, let's get along with others. And certainly the establishment of the State of Israel, because that's the proof that God or Allah, whatever, right, the forces of creation are saying, the Jewish people are back in the ancient homeland, just as written, and what had been before, one could say it should have been done or shouldn't have been done, doesn't matter, but it needs to be changed, and that is the way to conflict resolution. Because for many people, this clash is theological, and therefore I say the answer has to be theological. The answer cannot only be logical, deductive. Okay, the way Westerners think.
Thank you.
It's Greco-Roman thinking.
Okay.
We have to confront theology. and find the way to make it work. Now, this is the greatest crisis for jihadi Islam. It's a theological disaster because it means they have to stop and say, no, we are not fighting Israel. And no, we shouldn't be fighting Christendom either. Just stop. In other words, something you've been doing the whole time, it changed. And you're going back to the Meccan period. And I think there are countries that understand this. You have the United Arab Emirates. It's said that the Saudis nowadays are thinking in that direction. And what is known as the moderates, what I call the reformers. Because moderates, there are people who say they're moderate aren't exactly. I say the reformers say, look, we are rebuilding Islam. We are reforming it. We have reform in Judaism. And we know that in Christianity, they had Protestantism known as Reformation, whatever else. Not going to get into that. But that you could stop, rethink, recalibrate, and make religion, also in using the religious text, to say, that's what it is now. Because, right, we continue from one generation to the next, and we all want to be around for when the Messiah arrives, because it'll be the Messiah for everybody. So bad idea to blow each other to kingdom come, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and okay, this is recipe reform is the recipe for peace as I see it. Okay, and that's with my reading of the Quran and seeing what others have to say as well. Okay, and we are looking for peace. So that's more or less. I mean, I certainly have discuss further. I'd be very happy to take any questions that
Yes.
you may have.
Thank you, Israel. Quick question. Now, this abrogation is allowed in Islam. It's called nask. But what it says is how the earlier verses are replaced by the later verses. So we have a problem here, Israel, because the earlier verses had peace and towards the Jews, the recognition of the Jews, but the later verses don't. So how will this abrogation work? And you spoke about reverse abrogation. What's the difference between abrogation and reverse abrogation? Because the concept of nask is where later verses in the Quran cancel or amend the rulings of the earlier ones. So the Meccan period is undisputed. It is calling us to live in solidarity, with love, with our Jewish brothers and sisters. But the later verses have replaced that, or has it? How do we navigate this?
Okay, so there were Islamic scholars from the Middle Ages who simply began to speak of abrogating. It wasn't done, from what I was able to investigate, it wasn't done immediately. It was a matter of the Middle Ages, and what people say, they were divinely inspired. Now, there's always a question, who is divinely inspired and who is not? So if we ask a question, how is there a state of Israel today? And it says an ingathering of the exiles, right? Essentially, it says, everybody will be gathered here, right? Verses 103, 104, right? You will dwell in the land, right? And then the promise of the time in the hereafter. So if that's happening, you have to say, wait a minute. Maybe they were inspired for that time. Maybe it was a mistake because it's not coming down directly into, as we say, that Muhammad is having this recital, but simply was believed to be that because of the success of the conquests. But when the conquests stop and there's a rollback, especially with Christendom, okay, Israel's a very tiny area. But then one asked a question like Bernard Lewis, the famous Middle Eastern historian, and he said, Islam was asking what went wrong. And I've read his books and whatever else. And I say, wait a minute, if you want to look at it in a secular manner, you can ask what went wrong. But if we want to look at it theologically, maybe nothing went wrong. Just not paying attention to the signs being given. Maybe the establishment of a Jewish state and the ingathering, there are 7.5 million Jews in Israel today, out of a total population worldwide of 15 million. There were only 630,000 here in 1948. That's 3 generations later. This isn't some sort of divinely inspired immigration. In other words, let's look at this quote logically. Does it make sense that that could have happened? If we go back to Herzl, 1890s, and would say, put a bet on the table. There will be a Jewish state by the end of the 40s. I think in Las Vegas they would give you odds of 1,000 to 1, or maybe 10,000 to 1, right? So there's got to be a guiding direction that goes beyond just the logical deductive. Plus, after the Holocaust and persecution in the Middle East, Arab countries, Muslim countries, unfortunately, and much worse, of course, we had in Christendom, right? We speak of the Holocaust. So there is something here that is beyond just historical. And I say everybody should take a step back. Anybody who believes, why would Allah do this? Is it not part of a grand plan? Okay? And therefore, yes, it can be replaced. Who determined that you can't go back? The same scholars who determined in the Middle Ages of just going forward. They were human, right? So the question is, okay, so who's divinely inspired? Well, we're inspired by what we see as a reality. Okay? So that's how I look at it in any case.
Yes.
It's coming from a Jewish guy, you know?
Spirit of divinity into the reading. Yes. Thank you, Israel. Anila, you had a question, I'm sure. You're muted. You're not muted.
Thank you so much for sharing all of those, your research and the book that you have written. That's something that we need to do in the Muslim world as well. And, I look at all the research that is published. There was only one book, that Jews and Islam, and it's also not done by, an Islamic scholar. But I have recently met many scholars who are looking at the verses again, looking at the history of Islam and saying, look at the life of the Prophet and how, he was a leader of interfaith. When he was persecuted in Makkah, God told him to go seek refuge for his people in Abyssinia with Najashi, King Najashi. And when Islam, the early Islam was being persecuted, he was told to go to Yathrib, where the Jewish tribes were. So from his life, it's very clear that it was all about the reconciliation, or like the unity of the Abrahamic faiths. Also very new, and I don't know what you think of it, is in a lot of the scholars are now moving towards calling the Prophet of Islam at that time, early Islam, saying he was looking for Hanif he was a Hanif. He was he was a Hashemite, part of the most noble tribe, but he was a Hanafiya, following his grandfather's roots of Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him. And we are missing that in today's Islamic conversations, that, this is where the Prophet came from. Also, I don't know if in your study, you were able to see the roots of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His mother was a Jew from Yathrib. And when he was 6 years old, he saw her being buried. Now, these are all, he was in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was inspired by his people, the Christians, the Jews. And we are missing all of that. And we have gone to a text that is translated in many times in a very difficult and problematic ways, even for women. So the two people that lose out from all of these very problematic translations of our Holy Quran are minorities and women. And we forget the 1500 years of history in which there were emperors, they were the leaders from these dynasties, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, who looked at political Islam and not at the life of the Prophet, because that's what served their interest. And so I wanted to make this point and say, did you also consider all of these, that, as time went by, because even the translation, as Quran was transpired, written down much later, Caliph Usman and Umar, they were given those tasks, but much later. And so, where can we when young people ask me, where can we get, a translation that will show us a connection between the Quran and the Prophet's life as well, what do we seek? I have only one or two recommendations for the very same reason that you're saying. I wonder what you have to say to that.
Okay, so I think the emphasis has been on conquest. That's the biggest problem. And we know there were lots of peoples conquered here and there, and some of the Islamic conquests were horrific, as we know. And after having conquered, because usually during war things are terrible. The question is, how do you behave uh, afterwards, which is problematic. What I would say, okay, asking about translations. What I would say is that we take the early life of Muhammad, and that should be what we would be using, because we know in Medina there was also clash with the Jews, and there was the destruction of the Banu Qurayza tribe. There was also Khaybar. We hear it on campuses. Sometimes students screaming Khaybar, Khaybar, and they don't know the context of it, and which is very problematic. Uh, and what is happening, projecting from what happened in the 620s and 630s, also under Abu Bakr and Ottoman and right the early caliphs, projecting that on where we are today. Is that any way to make peace? But that's world war, and they don't understand it. So I say go back to the outset, and that's where the answers are. The original understandings that Muhammad had, and his overture to everybody, and his respect for the Jews and the Christians. Now, I don't know of other books particularly, and I wrote a chapter on it overall because I was really dealing with Hamas in my book, and all the chapters, that was leading up to Hamas, because I live here, and I was trying to actually figure out how the Oslo Accords fell apart. That was my first question, and then I ended up writing a book that went into other directions as well. You know how it is when you go to write something.
Yeah.
So,
Israel, tell our listeners about Khaybar. Why is it so offensive?
Khaybar. Khaybar was captured in the year 628. The Jews lost the battle. It was a Jewish date plantation. For about, several years, 5 to 10 or whatever, Jews paid a tax of 50%, and then they were completely banished. Khaybar means expel the Jews. That's what it means. Take everything they own and expel them. So when you hear it on campuses, like I think I saw a clip at Oxford or Cambridge in Britain, people don't know what they're saying. I see it and I say, whoa, that sounds to me like something from Central Europe in the 1930s. Okay? Because that's what Khaybar means. Also, we know that the last commandment that Muhammad had, that he gave, is there should be one religion in Arabia. Now, it never happened completely. There were Jews living in Yemen, always. In other words, it may have been there, but the question was it implemented completely? And Jews lived in Yemen. Yes, there was the status, as we know, under the Dima, whatever. Okay? But the point is to get past all of that, because I can always go over history, this happened and that happened. What happened in 1948 and then 67 and onwards tells us something theologically. This is apparently what Allah wants. Otherwise, it wouldn't be happening like this. Right? Remember, Israel was just involved in a war on 7 fronts, essentially. And there's still the issues of Gaza. We won't go into it. But how could it be that still survived it all with Iran against Israel? Right? Rockets from Yemen and whatnot. There's something here well beyond. We need to make peace. We are in a nuclear era also. I want to address what Anila said about women. I believe, and sorry, you and I discussed this extensively, right? That the greatest tragedy of the Abrahamic religions is that we have forgotten our female traits and our female side. And that goes for women as well as and men. Because let's call the female deity, let's call it the female traits, were taken out of our creator, God, in many cases. Yes, at times you say it was, I would say Rahman is shows compassion on and on, but it's only saying it. It's not necessarily doing it. It's only very often just for your people. No, that's not what is meant, because the all-embracing Earth Mother is for everybody. And that got taken out because of all the wars. And all it does is it self-propels itself into more conflict and more conflict. And therefore, these traits have to be brought back in big time. So everybody calms down and realizes we all come from the same root, right? As just mentioned, Muhammad and his background. And we know Ishmael, right? The whole in Islam that Ishmael went south into Arabia. We're all from the same roots. We're the same mother and father, if you want, right? And let's go back and make sure that we can get along by understanding each other, by being nurtured, and by nurturing.
Yes.
And it's not just women, men also.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also,
I
Soraya, I also want to mention something about the Battle of Khyber. You know how they are now using it as a chant to go against the Jewish people. That is highly inaccurate. That is really, remember that the Battle of Khyber was one of the battles that the Prophet had as he was spreading Islam. And it was a conflict that happened between a Jewish tribe that was living in. Now, there were many Jewish tribes that he was friends with, and they had signed a contract, a kind of an agreement that if the Quraysh attacked Medina and the tribes in Medina, that they would all fight against the Quraysh and not go behind and sneak up and kind of make friends with the Quraysh. And what happened was this Battle of Trench. There were some tribes, Jewish tribes, that were accused of making friends with the Quraysh and saying, we're going to go with you. And there were like security threats, there were political decisions, there were trade blocks. And unfortunately, many Jewish people were killed from that tribe. And so now the extremists use that to say Khyber, Khyber, without realizing that it was a political event. It was not a religious decision or an event. And the treaty was negotiated with the same people after that who said, yes, we're going to remain on the lands. So how does that not prove that it wasn't religious? It wasn't that Prophet Muhammad would never do that, because remember that we are coming from the same Abrahamic lineage. How could he do that to Khalilullah, the children of Abraham? And so I think these extremist groups are using this as a new tool. ISIS used to use other tools, that the Jews and Christians can't be your friends. And they used to use a verse it was seek them out and kill them. And that verse was, the Prophet of Islam was waiting outside Mecca to reconquer it. And he didn't want to raise his sword because he said, these are my own people. They may be pagans and they may be killing me, but Ya Allah, guide me. These are my own people. And I don't know what to do. Well, God then sent him a revelation and said, seek them out, go in there, seek them out and kill them and take over the house of Abraham, Kaaba. And this ISIS started using that verse to recruit and say, kill the pagans, kill the Christians, kill everybody who is not a Muslim, but also a Muslim like them. And I feel that Khyber is being used by the Hamas, the Hezbollah, and the new Daesh, and all these TTP and ATP, all the new terrorist organizations are using that to divide us.
Thank you, Anila. Yes. I want to ask two important questions on the topic of abrogation, because now we are exploring a theological renaissance to see if we can fight anti-Semitism. So abrogation, yes, Israel, it could be both the recitation and the ruling. The recitation can be abrogated, but the ruling can remain. But the recitation in the Quran can remain, but a ruling can be made. What kind of an abrogation are you thinking that is needed?
Okay, so what we have is this, and I'll use it from Jewish sources, okay? Because that's what I'm familiar with. We have, for instance, in Torah, that if someone lights a fire on the Sabbath, right, on Saturday, on Shabbat, that they should be stoned, right? But the rabbis said, no, we don't do that anymore. This is more than 2,000 years ago. Said, no, we don't do that. Say all of the harshest things there, will let the Messiah sort it out when he arrives. Because we have to be much more lenient with each other and with everybody around us. So I take that as an example. By the way, it's not the only example. There are tons of examples in Judaism because not only the Orthodox actually, quote, reform themselves without calling it reform. The reform that we know of today is very different. Okay? But that's why I say, yes, it's going to remain there. Nobody's saying change the Quran or change a holy text. They're saying emphasize this, de-emphasize that. There are things here we'll let the Messiah decide about when the arrival is here. Okay? And I think that that's the way to go. Because we are people and we want to live until that period of time. Just to get back to Anila's question, or in discussing what happened, what was known as the Constitution of Medina, there's a whole debate over whether, the Jewish tribes should have helped or not. Tribe was the Beni Koreza tribe, and they were accused of betrayal, on and on. Whatever happened there, okay, should not have bearing on what goes on today. That happened in the year 627. That's 1400, how much? Yeah, 1400 years ago. That's 1400 years ago. So you're going to project everything there, and then the battle the year later in Khyber in 628, you're going to say, and we're going to do that also. In other words, why does that have to have a bearing on Jewish-Muslim relations today? We are where we are. We have the right to move on historically. We are God's children, and God gave us a brain and a heart, and we should be using both of them. True. In order to ensure a better world.
Yes,
and that's what gets what people get, in that. And by the way, you have it in all religious. People start their starting point and ending point is at a major event well in the past, at a defining moment, and they're still living the defining moment. That's fine. I can have a Passover Seder and say as if I left Egypt, but then then I realize I'm here. Okay, yeah. I'm not crossing the Sinai. The same thing with all these battles, which of course becomes much more dangerous.
I have to interrupt because time is up. One of our colleagues Mustafa Akil wrote this book, Reopening Muslim Minds, a Return to Reason, Freedom and Tolerance. And I don't think Muslims have arrived. They don't plan to arrive. Whereas in Reform Judaism, the movement established in the 19th century explicitly modernized Jewish practices and beliefs. And the Christianity, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, initiated by people like Martin Luther, led to a massive schism within the Western Christianity, but Muslims have not. And I might ask this to you, Israel, is this because when you take anti-Semitism, is it because Muslims have been obeying coercive powers of the state? Look at the Arab revolt in the 1936. We were told to hate the Jews. Leave the Quran aside, So is it these coercive powers where we are told by these leaders, this is the way it should go? You think that, what role did that play in galvanizing anti-Semitism?
Okay. In galvanizing anti-Semitism, there's always a greater objective. Go from time of Pharaoh all the way up to what's going on in America today, and I use Mamdani as well as Tucker Carlson. If all the Jews were to disappear, these people would stop whatever protest, would stop their agenda would change. The agenda is to gain power. And by focusing hatred against the Jews or accusations against the Jews, it actually enhances their abilities, because people are taught, right, that there's something sinister going on behind the scenes. That's why things aren't good. And almost always when you come across prejudice, and when I grew up, okay, there was anti-Semitism, but there was more prejudice against African Americans. Let's face it, I grew up in the 60s. And it was always something was happening because there was this minority or that minority that was undermining it. And it's very, and their minorities get together and this crazy theories. But when people, and most people have a lack of self-confidence. So when they can't figure out why their world is not going the way they want, you just need a few demagogues. And the more religious they are, the better it works because they say, I'm getting my downloads from God. Well, we used to say visions. Now it's downloads, okay? But I'm getting it from the source and telling me that that's the way it is. I remember in the Southern United States, they would call African Americans, blacks, they would call them beasts, and they were convinced that they weren't human. I mean, you would see this stuff on TV when I was growing up as a kid, okay? But that was it, these slanders. So yes, anti-Semitism is used by certain states to consolidate power amongst the people, say, there's your enemy, get rid of it. And even if all the Jews were gone, they would say, there are secret Jews around here undermining us. Because we know there are certain anti-Semites, for instance, in Japan, there aren't any Jews there. I mean, I've read about areas where there are no Jews, but there are Jews. Or as my father told me when he was in the army, and very, very quick, give it 30 seconds here, he said, in World War II, he said that these Southerners who could barely read and write, they came from poor areas, Appalachia, they came and when they saw he was Jewish, the first thing they did is look for his horns on his head.
Yes.
And they asked why he didn't have horns. And he said, he tried explaining it logically, it didn't work. So he goes, they were cut off at birth. So they accepted that. But then these same soldiers who he became friends with, and they could understand that he was Jewish.
Yeah.
They said, my grandmother has a shotgun, or my grandfather has a shotgun to kill a Jew if he ever sees one. Right. Did they ever meet Jews? No, but they were always afraid one would come. They live way up in Appalachia. Okay, so that's where it's at. That's the issue. That's why I said
so this question is some wishful thinking. We know Islam was born in the 7th century in a world preaching monotheism in a polytheistic world. What if Meccans had all accepted Islam? Prophet would never have gone to Medina. Do you have such thoughts?
If they had all accepted Islam, Meccans. Would have been interesting. Abu Sufyan would have been out of a job. Okay. Would have been unemployed.
Out of a job.
But, well, he became a Muslim and his wife.
Out of a job.
And his wife also should become, what was her name? Hold on. I remember. Anyway, but so it would have been monotheistic. But the whole idea also, and I'll just touch on this for a second, the polytheism they also use against pluralism. I mean, I've read the jihadi thinkers from the 20th century, especially Said Qutb, right? Hassan al-Banna, Abdul Azam. And the whole thing of the pluralism is polytheism. In other words, the modern jihad scholars are making sure that any sort of advancement is evil and needs to be destroyed. And that whole line about the polytheists and the Jews being together because of the clash that took place that Anila mentioned, the clash that took place in Medina over the Constitution of Medina, how it was interpreted, blah, blah. They still use that as that the Jews stand behind everything that is polytheistic, meaning democracy, parliamentarianism, capitalism, socialism, whatever you want. Okay, so it's twisting it in order to have an enemy. So you could focus the average person's attention on that and say, this is what we're fighting, and it's a political move. It's very unfortunate because statistically, the percentage of Muslims killed by other Muslims because of jihad is something like 98 to 99% in the 20th century. It's not the Christians and Jews. In other words, even with 9/11.
If you take Hassan al-Banna, then Sayyid Qutb, then Maududi from India, who has done the greatest damage?
Who has done the greatest damage? I believe, well, okay, al-Banna set it up, but Qutb's the great thinker. He is, and the problem with Qutb is he wrote the famous series of books called In the Shadow of the Quran, which established him as a great thinker. And therefore, when he speaks of jihad, he has enormous authority. It's not like it's just basically his focus. al-Banna had more of a focus just on jihad. So you could say he wasn't a great thinker, right? In the scope of Islam. So Qutb, because of his scope, gives a lot of weight to it. I'll give you one other. Abdul Azam. because he fought on the battlefield of Afghanistan and defeated the Soviets, and he was there with his students. Taliban means students, right? His
Yeah.
students. So he is the jihad warrior, scholar, hero. So I take Kutab and Azam in general. And if you, Madaudi, the problem there is his impact is on Pakistan and Muslims in India. So altogether, you have what, 450 million. In other words, his impact, he wrote in Urdu, right? In Urdu.
Bangladesh
So his
too.
impact was very, very wide.
Yeah.
All right. So I give it to, if we have to choose, so it's Kutab, because Azam also quotes him quite a bit. He studied with Said Kutab's brother, Muhammad, right? I think it was in Saudi Arabia. So he was actually very close to,
Thank
And
to
you.
I
that
think
thinking,
that's
and he
also
adopted it.
Anila, yes.
Israel, that's also a lot of like the Saudis also got influence. Okay. Um, if we look at what Saudi Arabia is doing today, it's reversing all of that. It's trying to give women back their dignity, their rights. So I think, Soraya, if I want to end on us to end on a hopeful note, that there's a little ray of hope coming from Saudi Arabia now that it's changed the way it's thinking. And we have met the Emirati leaders, Saudi leaders, and they have said, yes, that was wrong, and this is now. No, we cannot hate the Jews and Christians. They're Ahl Kitab. And in UAE, all of a sudden, all these different houses of worship sprouted because there were talks of like, why can't you have a Bible in Saudi Arabia? And now we're also hearing of interfaith American tours going to Saudi Arabia. So there's a little ray of hope.
Thank you
No, I
so much.
believe there is.
Yes.
You have to start
I have
someplace.
I have one last question to you, Israel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your wisdom. You have a school. Is it open to Muslim students? Will you teach them all what they need to learn? And secondly, what message do you have for the Muslims?
Okay, so the academy that we set up after 7th of October, I was wanted to retire a bit, but it didn't work. So it's open to everybody. And I'd love to have Muslim students. I think it's very, very important because we have lots of discussions about many things. And I'll be preparing other courses as well. Right now, I have one, history of jihad, and another one about anti-Semitism. We're going to have one about Israel and the Middle East, on and on. And my message is never give up hope. We can turn this around. We're outnumbered, outgunned. The other side is called, they have tons of money. The Democratic side allows for lots of opinions, but if truth is with us, then we also know that the powers of creation are with us. And yes, in the end, we will come out on top with a pluralistic understanding. And my last word is there needs to be the women's empowerment. And I've said this for years now. There has to be, but what I'm talking about is female traits. Because there are women who could behave like jihadis, and there are men who are very nurturing, okay? But female traits, we trampled the female part of creation. And I have a friend who works in Kabbalah, and I asked him one time, something went wrong. I said, what is the biggest problem humanity is facing? I expected a long answer, but he said, Yisrael, we have forgotten our female side. And that was the end of the whole discussion. I expected him to go into a whole thing, because he's religious. Usually religious people have lots of sources. That's all he said.
Yeah.
And then I checked. I went to, that's the way it is. We
Thank
have
you.
to do that.
Thank
All
you.
of us together.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's never a last question with you, Israel. You open another space for another question. I want our audience to get to know you. Why are you looking for peace with the Muslims against all these odds? Who were you as a child? How did you get drawn to do what you're doing now?
Okay. Well, personally, I was born in the shadow of the Holocaust, the 1950s. I grew up in America with enormous guilt in the Jewish community that the Holocaust happened and they couldn't help their relatives because most were, they had left relatives in Eastern Europe. And I dedicated my life to coming to Israel, helping to build the state. Yes, I served in the army, but that's not what drew me at all. It was building a community, and I live on a hilltop here where it's religious, non-religious, and everything in between. The Jewish town I'm in, and then right across the way is the Bedouin town, where I negotiated with their with their leaders in 1998 to get them government recognition because they were unrecognized village and they wanted to move them someplace else. And they said, "Yeah, but we have some land here," and they didn't have much. And I said, that's when I understood that it's not just about building Israel and that Zionism is not complete if you don't have full, equal rights and opportunities for those who are not Jewish. This is meant to be democratic. The whole idea of Jewish nationalism is we come home and we flourish, but everybody with us flourishes as well. And from there, moving on, I ended up sort of confronting or understanding what was going on with women, with the Bedouin in particular. 25 years ago, their women wouldn't go out to get a taxi on their own or catch the bus. They had to have a male companion. Could be 9 years old. It's changed now. Their daughters teach in our nursery, okay, where we have children up to the age of 3. That's how well we get along. And in seeing this, that's what helped me understand, because it can be intellectual, then it has to be heartfelt, and then you have to see it done. Plus certain spiritual work, which is a whole other story of things that I've done in trying to be very, as we all try, to be connected with the powers of creation, to understand what is wanted of us, right? And why we're here on earth. We're not here just to breathe air and burn up time and collect as much material wealth as possible. That's not what we're here for. Okay? But this, as you say, is another conversation. What's
What
that?
percentage of Arabs live in your neighborhood, in the Galilee?
I didn't hear what type of.
What percentage?
Percentage. In the Central Galilee,
Yes,
Central
wherever you
Galilee,
live, yes.
or take the whole Galilee, is about 50-50%. Central Galilee, in the very center where I live, is 20% Jews, 80% Arabs, of which the Arabs are majority Muslim. And then you have Muslim Bedouin, who see themselves as separate because the tribe determines a lot. Christian Arabs and Druze, who identify also, they come from Arab background, but they identify very much as Druze. And we have some Circassians who are not Arab. They're Muslim, but they came down from southern part of the Soviet Union, I should say, southern part of Russia, the Caucasus areas in the mid-19th century. Wow. So we're a conglomeration. It's called a Galilean mosaic. Beautiful. And when you come here, I will show you around. We can go to different places.
We would love to do that. So you are in the midst of a majority Arab Muslim population and talking as a Jew about peace. We are deeply touched. Right. Thank you so much. Join us next Friday, 21st. We're going to have Imam Salima from Netherlands, who supported the BDS movement, but now she does not, because she has found the pay for slay by the Palestinian Authority is very un-Islamic. So we are going to be in conversation with her. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to give Anila the last word as we say goodbye and see you soon. Thank you, Israel, again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, we want you back.
Yes, and we want to partner with you in building understanding between our two communities and also educating people. I think it's so important. Unfortunately, the majority of the Muslim world is still highly uneducated and lives in poverty. And I think that contributes to a lot of ignorance. But I thank you for doing that. I look forward to seeing you in Israel. And I have shared some names of books for those that are following us. And then we'd love to promote your book as well and read it. So thank you so much for your work. God bless.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good one. Have a good day. And
Thank you.
We'll be in touch again for sure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.